Hello, I'm Rebecca Balcárcel, and I'm a professor of English in Texas in the United States, and I'm also the 6-Minute Scholar on YouTube. And I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm so thankful to Mrs. Gita for inviting me to speak with you. Let's talk about poetry, and I am going to reveal my secret about how I unpack a poem, how I dive inside the poem, and try to learn all it can tell me about life and about language. Okay, first, I start in the very middle circle here. I look at the speaker of the poem, the situation, and the message most carefully. So let me explain each one. The speaker of the poem is not the author. Sometimes the author seems to be telling us about his or her own life, but the speaker of the poem means the voice on the page, the voice putting the words out there. It's almost an imaginary character the author has created to speak the poem. So, who is speaking? This is a question I ask immediately. What kind of voice is coming across? What kind of personality is talking to me? And what is the tone of the speaker? Is the speaker joking? Is the speaker serious? Are they romantic or thoughtful or harsh? The speaker is very important. And the psychology of the speaker, the mentality, the lifestyle of the speaker, the way the speaker looks at the world will come across in the poem and the message of the poem. Now, the situation for me is the place that the poem seems to be in, the objects that are around. The whole situation includes the events that happen in the poem, if there are any. If the poem tells a story, then it's the story. So the speaker and the situation. I try to figure out those things. Without those things, I won't be able to figure out the message. And that's the third most important thing. The message is the insight that the poem wants to give. An insight about life, about how it is to be human, sometimes about a particular aspect of life. Maybe it is a message telling us how we should be or how we can be happy. Sometimes the poet is pointing out darker aspects of life or showing us something troubling. But the message of the poem is what I am taking away, what I am supposed to carry away from the paper into my life. How will I apply the poem to my own life, my own perception of life, my way of living? So, speaker, situation, message. Later, I learn about the author. That's an outer layer for me. Sometimes knowing about the author is very interesting and adds more depth, more insight into my understanding of the poem. But I am focused more on the speaker, situation, and message first. The author adds extra layers, which I enjoy. And then I also like to learn about the culture and the time period that this poem comes out of. So it matters whether the poem was written in a time of war or in a time when there was a great economic upheaval, when there was a pandemic, maybe. It can be interesting to know what was going around as this poem was being written. And same with culture, what nationality or what heritage is behind the poem. This can add another layer of richness. However, the speaker, the situation, and the message are often universals that transcend particular times and particular cultures and the individual author. And so that is why I start with those key things. And that is what we will look at next in a poem by Lucian Blaga. Okay, so let's look at this poem. Will you weep or will you smile? And I have to say that Mr. Blaga was new for me, such a giant of literature that I did not know about. And so I am now going to be exploring more of his work. But let's look at his poem, and I'm going to present you my own translation of the poem. And then actually I'll talk about the translation. But first, let's just look at the speaker first. I have no regret that in my soul I also gathered mud. But I wonder about you. With claws of light, a single morning will shred your dream that my soul is as pure as your mind wishes, as your love, in its deepest place, believes. Will your tears stream then, or will you forgive? You may weep, or you may smile in the rays of that dawn in which I say to you, with no shadow of shame, you know, yes, that only out of mud-bottomed lakes grows the lotus. What a beautiful poem. So, the speaker, the very first line is I, and the word I is on a line all by itself. So, this is a very confident speaker. This speaker knows what he is about, or she. This speaker is very self-aware and not concerned with some inner problem, but actually concerned about the other person. So the speaker says, I have no regret that in my soul I have gathered mud. So gathered in not only the light and beauty, but mud. So I have gathered mud into myself, and I'm okay with that. The speaker is not ashamed, is not regretful, but is at peace with the fact that he is part mud and part light. So I have no regret that in my soul I also gathered mud, but I wonder about you. And here he starts to speak to a universal situation. When we love someone, we see them in a halo. We see their perfection and we ignore their faults. We are blinded to their shortcomings. We don't pay any attention to people who say, hey, did you realize this person is actually not very thoughtful? Or did you realize this person is very egotistical? No, we don't see that. We just see all the good things. And this is part of why love is sometimes called a sickness, because it seems that people are in some kind of altered state when they're in love. So that's why this speaker is worried. He says, I'm worried about you. I wonder if you will think badly of me when you learn the truth about me. So let's go on. With claws of light, a morning will shred your dream. Or really the word is kill, isn't it? It'll kill that dream, that vision of the perfect person. And the speaker is saying, I am not perfect. I have the mud. And I'm not ashamed of being imperfect. But maybe you will cry when you realize that I am not that magical vision. I'm a real person. And I have faults. And actually, my faults even make me individual, make me who I am. So, with claws of light, very vivid line, a single morning will shred your dream. So, the morning is the light of understanding. So, it'll only take one, like the claws of understanding, one moment of actually seeing me in the light, not in delusion, misty fog, but in clear morning light, that's the realization that you'll have, that I am not perfect. So your dream will be shredded, will be killed at that point. And the dream that you have is that my soul is pure, as pure as you wish it were, or that my your love in its very heart is thinking that I'm perfect, and you wish and desire for me to be that perfect person, but I'm not that person. So we have the illusion broken. You may weep or you may smile in the rays of that dawn. So when that light pierces into you, the dawning realization comes. He's not perfect. Now, will that be an okay moment, or will it be sadness, a time for sadness? But already the speaker is thinking, I know what I'll say to you then. I will say, you know, don't you, that the lotus grows from mud. And this is an ancient symbol. It's a Hindu symbol, a Buddhist symbol. The water lily or the lotus has its roots in the mud of the bottom of the lake and a long stem up to the light, and there's the bloom on top of the water. And this speaker is saying, I am like that flower. I have the mud as part of my soul, part of myself, but out of that grows all the good things about me. So I do have intelligence, even though sometimes I have ignorance. I do have generosity, but sometimes I have selfishness. I am a mixture, and the mud is part of me. And in fact, my virtues grow out of the mud. And I say this is an ancient idea because many spiritual teachings talk about how our flaws are all chances to learn. So in our selfishness, we want, let's say we want food for ourselves. We have hunger. We have those base instincts. Every human being has this because we are part animal, right? So our hunger, when others are generous to us and give us food, we start to understand that the other person also has hunger, and we have appreciation, and we realize that we can be that giving person as well as the taking person. And out of our own instincts, we realize that others have those same needs. We develop empathy, and so we do become generous because we don't want others to suffer. But it's only when we first suffer that we can start understanding the suffering of others. So we do have the dark parts of ourselves, the instinctual parts, the flaws, and then we have our growth from those into virtue. And of course, this speaker is saying to to the you know this, don't you? And it's a little bit of a reminder, like you should already know this, but I'm going to remind you that I am part mud and I'm not ashamed of it, but you shouldn't expect me to be 100% light or 100% flower. I also have roots in the mud. So this, of course, speaks to how we all have that illusion that people are better than they are, especially when we're in love, in a romantic love. But doesn't this also apply to parent-child? The child believes the parent to be perfect and powerful. And the parent does have virtues and does have some power. But as we grow, we realize that the parent also has flaws, blind spots, and that we have to love them anyway, don't we? And we hope to be loved anyway, with our flaws, with our faults, with our mud, and our blossom, because we're whole this way. So you can see how I already spoke about the speaker, this confident person who is not worried about himself, but only about the you in the poem, the beloved or the friend. Situation, really, this poem doesn't have a lot of events going on except this thought of what will you say? What will you think of me once you realize that I am not perfect? Now, the message of the poem, I spent quite a long time there talking about the poem's message that we are not perfect. That could be a message. We could say that the poet wants us to know no one is perfect. We could say that the poet wants us to know that we all have the mud and the flower, that we all have dark and light. The poet might want to point out that growth comes from flaws and faults as we learn more about ourselves, more about each other. What is the poet trying to get across, and what am I supposed to take away from the poem? It could be all of those things. I also think, in particular, this poet is pointing to the difference between illusion about who I really am and reality about who I am, and that love should embrace the reality. So that's one of the messages I think I will take away from the poem. So, ideas about translation. I made my own version of this poem, and a lot of people might say, well, you don't speak Romanian, so what are you doing? But let me explain to you my concept of translation and my concept of reading, and you may still feel like I shouldn't be translating this poem, but we'll see if maybe I can explain to you what I'm trying to do. So, when you read the poem in Romanian, the reading itself is an interpretation. The version that you have in your head of the poem is not exactly what the poet put on paper. The next reader will read the poem in slightly different ways than you read the poem. So now we have three versions of the poem: the poet's version, your version, and the person next to you. And actually, every other reader, right? So every reader creates the poem mentally, and it becomes your poem. So the translator is in a similar position. I create the poem mentally. Now, I am at a disadvantage not speaking Romanian. I am using translations. Ideally, I would have 2 or 3 translations to look at. Even more ideally, I could talk to a native speaker of Romanian, and I would ask for flavors and nuances of each word. I might ask for some cultural context, and this would enrich my understanding of the poem. But eventually, the poem in my mind, the thoughts that are created by the poem, the images in my head that the poem puts out into my mind, like the claws of light, that image is what I will put in the English version. And while I'll try to be somewhat faithful to the direct translation, like the word claws, that's a great word in both languages, I will use it. I am not foremost trying to make a literal version. I am not trying to just do an equal sign between the Romanian and the English with Google Translate in the middle, because it produces a poem that does not work well in English. It is clunky, it is not musical, it is not clear. And the versions of this poem that I found in English did not satisfy me. And so I worked to try to create the poem in my mind that I could put into English words, and I did make changes. So in one place where there was morning, I put dawn. Dawn is really the same, but not exactly the same. And an English speaker, and probably you, know that those two words are not identical. And I wanted the flavor of dawn, because dawn is so often related to a dawning realization, that the word dawn is more evocative of the dawning of understanding than the word morning, because most people don't say the morning of my understanding in English, but they do say the dawn. So I made that little choice. So this really speaks to the question of what is a poem? Is it the words on the page? And I would say it is not. I think the poem is the change in your heart that comes from reading the poem, the images in your mind, the thoughts you're thinking, the experience you have of the poem is the poem. So I have a picture of translation in my mind. I'm going to try to depict it for you. So you have the poem, and it's like a cloud in the air. And it is the thought, the image, the emotion that the poet wants to convey. And the poet has this experience of this cloud poem, let's call it. And then the cloud, let's say it has a strike of lightning down into the poet's mind. And the poet speaks Romanian. And so the poet creates a Romanian poem out of the cloud poem. So the true poem is the cloud poem, and it makes a Romanian poem. Now, when I make my English translation, partially I am going to go across to my English using dictionaries. But what I really want to do is go from the Romanian back up to the cloud poem. And I want the lightning to come down into the English, and that spark of inspiration to still be alive, instead of just across where it might die. I want to climb backwards into the cloud poem and retransmit it to English. It gets transmitted to the poet, and then we take it back up, and then it gets retransmitted down to the translator. This is my image of translation. So the true poem is without language, right? The true poem is an idea, but we need language. It's like the clothing, and we have the soul of the poem up here, and it goes into Romanian clothing, and it goes into English clothing, or French clothing, or German clothing, or Russian clothing, or whatever. But the poem is the thoughts, the images, the situation, the message, the insight, and that can be kept alive from language to language. And I think the native English speaker in this case, like I am, is able to shape the English to be poetic more than someone who doesn't have the fluency in the new language. I have the disadvantage of not knowing the Romanian. It's true. But for English readers, it's very important that I know how English strikes their ears. So the perfect translation setup would be collaboration between a native speaker and then in both languages. Like you have a native Romanian speaker, you have a native English speaker. They can both try to inform what this cloud poem is, this thought poem, this spirit poem, this Platonic ideal poem, and then bring it into each language, or into the new language. But if you don't have that ideal situation, at least it's helpful to know that the true poem is not the words. So there's my theory of translation, and I have done other translations, but this is the first time from Romanian, and I love this poet very much, so I will be looking up more Lucian Blaga poems and trying to maybe translate some more of them. We'll see. I hope you've enjoyed looking at poetry with me. from how I read poems with the speaker, situation, and message as my first focus, and then author, and then cultural context and time period. And then my take on my look at the Blaga poem, which is now one of my favorite poems, and then also my ideas about translation. And what I'd like you to take away with you today is that poets don't want to confuse you, trick you, hide from you. It feels like some poets are trying to be difficult on purpose, but actually, the mission of poetry is to help you live a richer life, to show you something new, or to show you the same thing through new eyes. The poet wants to touch your heart, to connect with you, mind to mind, or soul to soul. That's what the poet is trying to do. And I hope that's a little bit of what we have done today as we connected across the ocean and across time through internet. I hope that we have had a connection. And please reach out to me. I have a website and a contact page, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this poem or any of these ideas. Thank you so much for having me, and have a lovely, lovely day.